Hi, I'm Phil Ball, pastor of Odyssey Christian Church in Jenks, Oklahoma. We're part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we offer a non-judgmental approach to support your personal journey of faith. After the message, we invite you to keep listening for a presentation from our wonderful band. And if you want to experience worship live, we invite you to find out all the details at www.facebook.com/Odyssey CC. But we're gonna. It just came over me, and I'm not sure. Some of you I've told individually, but it just came over that we have so little time, and a lot of us are from traditional church, and in traditional worship, during Advent, you'd like to have a festival each day because it brings a lot of people and all kinds of things, and the institution is nurtured, and all kinds of things happen like that are real positive. Well, but we're different. And I've been part of all the festival making for such a long time. And we have a festival at the beginning of Advent, and we have a real nice special service just before Christmas. And we will continue those. But that gave us 2 weeks that we could really mess with the crux of the Christian story. And that, as they say in all the conservative ads, Christ, don't forget the Christ out of Christmas and things like that. Well, we're going to start looking at it now because there's so much richness there for us to delve with. And there's so much that we can do good. And I'm really excited about that. So that's what we're doing in this time. And I've come to believe that more than anything, the birth stories around Jesus matter because they're bigger than just birth stories, and we'll figure out what that's about. But they have to do with what the character of God, what God is like. That those stories weren't done to describe, historical fact, like you'd been there with your camcorder, you'd see the same thing, or your iPhone, or however you take pictures these days. But they were done for a different purpose, and for us to get clear about that purpose is so rich. And so, in order to do that, we're going to spend some time working together to learn to read biblical text. And you don't have to have Bible in your hand. And I think it'll be fascinating to you because it's not going to look like that's what we're doing, but it really is. But the idea in all of this is so that the Bible will come alive to you. I mean, because it's some reason, I don't know if it's God's fault or what, it came alive to me a long time ago. And when it did was I was using the Episcopalian Book of Common Prayer to guide my preaching when I was at a 2-point charge south of Norman, Oklahoma. I was preaching at Lexington, Oklahoma at 9:30 in the morning. I got in my Camaro, drove north to Noble, Oklahoma, and preached there at 11. And I would study the lectionary. And as I went through the lectionary, I was like, this is amazing. You'd think that somebody's gone to seminary and all that kind of stuff would have memorized the Bible, but that's not the truth. And so I want it to come alive for you. And so in order to do that, we're going to begin looking at kind of what happened to Europe after, and we're going to go quickly, but after the Roman Empire began to collapse. And that will help us understand why we look at the text the way we do and how we need to change how we look at it. And so I will swear to you that there's going to be no test on the next 4 slides, none whatsoever. Just let this stuff kind of wash over you and try to get a feel for it. Because if you want to find out more about it, you can do it on Wikipedia or someplace else. Okay, do you remember in European history that they called everything from about the 5th century to about the 15th century the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, okay? And can you read that stuff? Oh, you can actually kind of almost read it. I wasn't sure if you could read it or not because I kept trying to get it as big as I could, and it was still hard to read, but fear not. We're not going to look at each one of those. I don't care about each one of those. I want you to get a feel for it. It was a time of intellectual darkness, economic regression, and it followed the collapse of the big Roman Empire. And all those yellow lines in the blue there in the middle of the chart show you what happened at different times in the 1,000 years. If you can believe that, it lasted 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And when we talk about the 15th century, we're really talking about 1400 and whatever you do in those times, okay? And In the upper left, when it first starts, Constantine, the Roman emperor, makes Christianity the state religion. And then it began to develop. And the Pope and the papacy at Rome went through some struggles early on in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries. But in the 7th century, did anybody remember a guy named Charles the Great? Charlemagne? Okay. He had a really unique way of evangelism. It was more like what ISIS is doing in the Middle East today. He basically said, become Christian or I cut off your head. And so he evangelized all of Europe into Christianity, and that gave the Roman church a lot of power because that was the only church. And what happened and evolved is you know how power corrupts. Well, the Roman church got big and powerful and controlled so much of Europe that like Henry IV of England was excommunicated for wanting more control of the civil power in England. Because the church controlled the civil power and the religious power and all of society. But there was some really good things that happened during that time, like the Magna Carta was signed by John of England, but there were some bad things, like in the 1300s, the bubonic plague, which came from the east, reached Europe and just devastated Europe. And it says nothing about the crusades that were going on to the Holy Land and the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century rising and doing a bunch of stuff in North Africa that was very different than what was happening in the Middle Ages. But after 1,000 years, and Alan, I'm shifting now because it's hard to know when I'm changing. After 1,000 years of dark ages, what happens is a renaissance, is a rebirth. And think about it, we're that way, all of us. You know, if we have, like, we get tired of staying indoors because it snows all the time. I remember the year 3 or 4 years ago, we didn't have church 4 or 5 times because it was just too dangerous to get out and get us all there. Everybody gets cabin fever, and then you get out and you just want to go do something. Well, that's basically what happened in Europe. The Dark Ages were open, a rebirth of cultural movement that spanned a period roughly from the 14th to the 17th century in Italy. In the late Middle Ages, it all blossomed. And it's a lot like what happened with Jesus. Jesus was just one of those explosions in the Middle East that did some very special things back in his day. And this is the time of Michelangelo, Martin Luther, the first printing press, when Henry VIII of England separated himself from the Roman church and said, I'm not going to have the Pope be the chair of the church anymore. I'm going to be the head of the church, and started the Church of England. He had a problem with marriage, and the church kept nullifying, you know, every time he got finished with a wife. There's all kinds of interesting things that goes on there. But the Roman church had suppressed and oppressed and controlled people from the time of Charles the Great to the time of Martin Luther, and all that just got exploded and knocked off. And the last slide on the bottom, or the last panel on the bottom over here that you cannot read in 1,000 years, has to do with the 30 Years' War. And it was a 30-year span of time in which Protestants and Catholics all fought each other. Like any group that had power and lost power, the Roman Church wanted to beat up everybody that was a Protestant. And the Protestants said, we're going to beat you up because we want to be what we want to do. And out of that, fully 1/3 of the population of Europe died. And a large of it was disease out of that 30 Years' War. So there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of chaos in the midst of rebirth. And so what we have in the previous is this long period of stagnation followed by just an explosion of stuff, which leads to where I really want to bring you, which is the Enlightenment. After the stagnation, followed by the wild breakout, you might imagine how people were glad to embrace a more rational, reasonable, intellectual approach, and thus reducing both the mystical and traditional change which had held them in the past. The Age of Enlightenment was a cultural movement of intellectuals beginning in the 17th century in Western Europe, emphasizing reason and individualism and tradition, and it spread across Europe and the United States, okay? So some of the guys up there, can you read any of that? Oh, you can see that. Okay, just check some of that out and see, is there light? What light's in your eyes, girl?
No,
Are you okay? Okay.
Yeah, I was just laughing because you say you can see that.
Well, it was like, oh, you can read that one. But you look like, for instance, on the Wealth of Nations that Adam Smith said, and assuming that a free economy will balance itself out, you know, that kind of new thought. Or the top on the left with John Locke, The people are the most important part of any nation, not the ruler. The job of the government is to protect the national rights of its citizens. You can tell this whole new awareness, this whole new consciousness is coming out. And it's really rational, it's really organized, and it's really a put down of the emotional times of things. And Alan, go to the next slide. The intent of the Enlightenment was to reform society using reason, to challenge ideas grounded in tradition and faith, and advance knowledge through scientific method. It promoted scientific thought, skepticism, and intellectual interchange. Now, that's the thing that we've inherited in our time, and it served us quite well. I mean, we learned how, for instance, when the Virgin Galactic blew up in the sky, then they're going over there and they're figuring out what screwed up. And they're going to figure all that out. They're going to analyze it. They're not just going to say, it was the will of God. They're going to figure that stuff out, and that served us in so many realms. This whole new way of thinking about the world based on observation and a willingness to question assumptions. Because during the Renaissance, anybody that questioned the assumptions of the church, like Copernicus or Galileo, got put in prison, because they had new thoughts. And so we really bought into that. So all the history stuff is over. You can take a breath now. Okay. And I've taken you this trip so that you might recognize how we have been conditioned to relate to the world and how different it is to pick up and read and make sense of a piece of literature, which is the Bible, that was written, the best scholars using this Enlightenment process, scholars have analyzed this, felt like that it was written in the 7th century before the Common Era and was written entirely different purpose than to reveal historical fact regarding the subjects and events portrayed in its pages. It was written for something different. And for us to apply history or factual stuff to it is inappropriate. It's what is seen more clearly in the birth stories of the New Testament. We can begin to apply what I'm going to call that Enlightenment stuff to it. But yet we're able to jump into a new place. And so let me carry that forward. I just want to tell you that's where we're going. I want to tell you that modern biblical scholarship has employed most of the analytical styles and practices born in the Enlightenment. But that only takes us so far. For example, in the accepted Gospels of Jesus, and by the way, I heard Brandon Scott at Phillips Seminary once in a meeting I was with him. He said that they've been able to find little scraps and little pieces of 85 gospel accounts, okay, that were all these variety of gospel accounts. They can't find the whole ones, that they just find these little scraps, and they have different, kinds of language and different words in them, so they know where the different things. But the ones that we got are 4. And there are some conspiracy people who would say, well, the church couldn't stand it, so they cut them all out. And that's just, I believe, completely erroneous and dumb, because what really happens is it's like a bunch of hymns, that there's been thousands of hymns that are written. But if you go to a hymn book, you get the ones people love the most. You get the ones that people worked at the most. And I'm convinced that's how we got our 4 Gospels. Those were the ones that everybody would look at them and go, this Matthew, he's really got some good stuff in here. It's different than this Luke guy, but he's got some good stuff too. We don't want to throw him out. And this John guy, he's really unusual, but he is special. We want to keep him. And this Mark is so brief and to the point. Mark is only 14 chapters long. You can pop through that and no problem at all. You don't have to read all 28 chapters of Matthew. There's some real gifts in that. And so they begin to look at it, and they use all these analytical styles, and they figured out, wait a minute. Mark, which is the earliest of the Gospels, written around 65 as best they can tell, there's no birth story in that. Well, does that mean that it just wasn't important to that part of the church at that time? Maybe so. Paul, who wrote, one of the reasons people love Paul so much is he's the earliest writer of any of the New Testament books. He was writing in the 50s, back during rock and roll and, no, that's right, that was 1950s, okay. He was writing in the 50s, okay. And so you get some pictures of the early church from that kind of a thing. But they think that Matthew and Luke were writing around 85 or 90, and John was even later than that. But by 85 or 90, this birth story stuff became really important to the church, and so it got included in these Gospels, and it was very important. But this is just so cool. It was important to them. But the 2 Gospels, Matthew and Luke, have such different birth stories. And by way of the enlightenment of analysis and looking at it, I want to draw a picture for you. And to then come to a point that I really hope makes sense for you. That we're moving towards seeing all these stories with a third eye is the way I talk about it. So the important question is not, did it happen, or did it happen this way, or did it not happen, or I'm going to disprove it. And then ends up with Anna the prophetess in a little bit later section of it. Luke focuses on the parents of John the Baptizer. Matthew has no mention of John or his parents. Luke has more music or poetry, things that the Roman church has really lifted up. Has anybody ever heard of the Nunc Dimittis besides me? You have to. Okay. It is a piece of poetry in Luke that's now, Master, you may let your servant rest in peace because of that. And there's all these little hymns and poems in Luke's stuff. In Luke's story, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth and must travel to Bethlehem. In Matthew's story, Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem and Jesus is born in a house. Now, if you think I'm making this up, go back and read the text, okay? Just get the Bible open and look at it. All right, but you have to read it in detail. You can't just slough right through it. And it doesn't take some special translation to figure this stuff out. It's just laying there in front of us. Okay. In Matthew's story, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus must flee to Egypt because Herod fears and is threatened by this new king that the wise men tell him about. While in Luke's story, the family simply returns to Nazareth and not are afraid to come to Jerusalem for Jesus' purification and for when Jesus comes back at the age of 12. It's not a big threat. Luke's story extends into Jesus' infancy, being presented in the temple, showing up as a 12-year-old, discussing theological matters with the teachers. Matthew's story has Joseph, Mary, and Jesus always guided by dreams and an angel, returning after Herod's death. But they had to return to Nazareth because Herod's son had taken his place in around Judea where Bethlehem is. And they had to go to the north where Herod in Antipas was. And we talked about him a couple of weeks ago, but it was another one of Herod's sons. And so if you take everything literally and factually and regard either of these stories as factual history, the matter in which we think of history, we're going to have to decide which one is true because they're both so different, they both can't be literally true. And so that's why I'm trying to get us to learn to let go of that. And the approach that we work on, that both Borg and Crossan suggest, is to, and this is your phrase, to set aside your need for these stories to be factual. Just set them aside and allow these stories to dance with you in another way. And we're going to that. I'm willing to stake my life and my ministry on this belief that the conviction that we actually do severe disservice, which in reality dishonors the value of the religious text, when we ask it to be either factual or historical. We put the text in a prison when we limit its truth and meaning or relevance to our lives based on factual, historical authenticity. And let me explain. I want you to hear this quote from Pablo Picasso. We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth, at least the truth that is given to us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of his lies. Now, the pictures on the screen are of 3 different paintings of the same parable that Jesus told. Anybody? Anybody? Prodigal son, rock and roll, got it, okay? Now, if you allow all of these to be authentic and ask what meaning might you have, you may be impacted by one of them. Maybe you're impacted by Rembrandt up on the upper left at the way he's designed that out and laid it out in those colors. Or maybe the one on the bottom. And these other 2 guys, I looked up who they did it, and they're these Italian dudes. I can't even say their names. But at the bottom left, maybe you're impacted by the fact that when you finally came back, the first person to greet you was the family dog. Okay? Or maybe you're impacted by the way in which this robe embraces your nakedness when you've come home. it's like all of these stories are true because all of those pictures are true because they're not, the issue is so far beyond factuality. It has to do with the human experience, and that's why the text becomes alive. And for us to ask it to be factual is to try to take that out of it. I have never been moved by a history book like I've been moved by these stories. Okay? History books just tell me, that Columbus sailed the ocean blue and green and orange in 1952, or however when he did that. They don't pick me up. They don't tell me about the angst that I feel. They don't tell me about my struggles. They don't tell me about this stuff. And so that the issues of Jesus and the parables take us to new places. Nobody ever asked for one of the parables to be true. And what I'm convinced of is once we release these birth stories from the limits of the chains of superficial values of factual historical truth, we open the door to our understanding. We open the door to them becoming meaningful to us. And we're going to move a little bit forward to that because the idea is that our transformed hearts are changed by it. That our transformed hearts can experience what Borg and Crossan use another great phrase, the surplus of meaning that are in these stories. And there is such a surplus of meaning, which is why I wanted us to start in November, because there's a surplus of meaning that we can glean from this. Two of the greatest parables are the two told around the birth of Jesus as his spirit grew in the Christian community and the community reflected Christ's meaning in their lives. The parables were subversive stories. Now, subversive, I have to look these words up because, that's what the quiet generation or the silent generation in the 60s used to talk about the hippies, that they were subversive. And indeed they were, because subversive means that to overturn or undermine a government or authority. The parables of Christ's birth are subversive stories. Christ's birth announced that Jesus, not Herod, was king of the Jews. But it was a different kingdom. It wasn't an earthly kingdom. Herod had nothing to worry about. Herod was more like the Pharaoh, the lord of Egypt, the lord of bondage and oppression and violence and brutality. And Herod's son was no different than his father. And Jesus, all he was grace and compassion and justice and healing and teaching and miraculous power and humility. And he was the king of the Jews. And when we make him, quote, king of our lives, then a transformation happens. It's not connected to bondage and oppression. And not the established order, the Roman authorities, the local king, the religious authorities, the high priest, the scribes, Pharisees, or other established leaders. None of these were the king of God's people. It was this infant boy, this vulnerable, soft, nonviolent infant boy. The subversive parable that God is king, seemingly helpless baby king who is God's king for all people for all time. Remember our definition of subversive. Overturn, undermine. Overturning and undermining in the birth story is done by a quiet infant who's even as an adult doesn't use violence. It is subversion and transformation from oppression and violence to love and patience and grace and forgiveness and healing and help. It is a transformative, life-giving subversion. I know that I have been actively and nonviolently subversive for love, for truth, for justice, for compassion, for patience. I know that my personal authority has been subverted by another person that I happen to be married to's love and patience and grace and forgiveness. That it's been transformed. Like, be a little bit more patient with those puppies. Have you ever been around anyone who changed the world order or the way things are in your life and made it full of love and helped and nurtured and held on with the big robe? Let me tell you something really subversive. And you can look up on the screen for this. I think it's up there. Good job. And I changed the introduction so it was smooth. Let me tell you something really subversive. Love is everything it's cracked up to be. That's why people are so cynical about it. It's really worth fighting for, being brave for, risking everything for. And the trouble is, if you don't risk everything, you risk even more. I see a star. I see a star guiding us to a new king. A king of peace, a king of compassion, a king of forgiveness, a king of love. I hear it will take me to the very source of all being. I think I'll follow it and see what happens. Let us pray. Dear God, we come to you in a dance of your Spirit. We come allowing the text to be alive in our experience. We come setting aside our needs out of the enlightenment, out of the fear of chaos, out of the fear of oppression, to actually trust that your Spirit can move in and through us in new and redemptive ways. We come in celebration of your love, and we pray that you will guide us as we take this journey with your parable and your wonderful life. Amen.